Okay, well, good evening, Facebook world. Good evening, friends and family. Good evening, Mythic Mission subscribers and fans. We've got a special episode here tonight, episode number 29 of Mythic Mission. I've been in a hiatus for the last few weeks and want to finish out August strong with an interview with one of my friends here, Justin Wiggins, who I'm going to introduce here in a moment. We've got some great episodes coming up this fall, so please make sure that you are on our subscriber list and you follow us at www.mythicmission.com. And we hope you can join us for a few minutes, if not the whole hour here tonight, for our conversation with Justin about his book, Surprised by Agape, and that if you don't get to catch it, that you can subscribe to the show afterwards on Anchor or Spotify or iTunes and catch the recorded episode at your leisure. So we're having a conversation tonight. This is going to get into some usual territory on Myth and Lewis and the Inklings, but we're just going to kick back and toast our Friday night together. Justin, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's an honor. Cheers.
It's good to know you. Yes, cheers. So we, Justin, we're toasting to a lot of people tonight. We've got our friend David Bates, who we owe the honor and pleasure for these beautiful pints that we've got here. He's expecting a son coming into the world soon, so we'll have prayers for him and his wife and their newborn. And we want to say thank you to David for having us on his podcast, and hope that he is able to catch up with this one at some point. And I think also to give thanks just for the gift of Tolkien and Lewis, among others. Is that right?
Absolutely, my friend.
Yeah. So we've both been impacted and shaped by these great scholars, and tonight we're going to talk about your journey and your book, and how in particular C.S. Lewis shaped your journey in coming to faith. And I can't wait for people to learn more about you and your book, and hope that they will buy it. It's available on Amazon in the show notes for the podcast edition. And I suppose I'll see if I can sneak it into on the Facebook a little later on. You'll have a link where you can get Justin's book, Surprised by Agape, which is available on Amazon. You can buy it as a paperback. You can get it as a Kindle edition. And I'm sure he would love for you to read it. It's a wonderfully readable book, very lucid, personal, profound, very impactful. And so I hope you'll be able to resonate with it like I have in some ways. Our journeys kind of intersect. So that's wonderful. Well, let me introduce my guest and my new friend here. Justin and I are becoming friends. We have a lot of common interests, so this is good. Let me tell you a little bit about who Justin is, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And Justin, if it's okay with you too, I just want to read a little portion after I introduce you from the beginning of your book that I think sets the tone for this evening's conversation. Is that okay with you?
Indeed. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Let me go ahead and get my notes up here. So Justin Wiggins is a local writer that works and lives, and I'm jealous of this, in the primitive, majestic, and beautiful mountains of North Carolina. He graduated with his bachelor's in English literature from Montreat College, with a focus on C.S. Lewis studies in May of 2018. His first book was Surprised by Agape. We're going to be talking about that tonight, published by Grant Hudson of Clarendon House Publications. He has also had poems and other short pieces published by Clarendon House Publications, the C.S. Lewis Sehnsucht Journal, and by Sweetie Cat Press. Justin has a great zeal for life, work, community, writing, literature, art, which we're going to talk about tonight, pubs, bookstores, and coffee shops. And Justin, among the many reasons why I like you and enjoy your company, I love all of these things too. So welcome again onto the show.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, so I think this is the Kindle edition, Justin, that I've got, and I'm going to get a paperback copy of your book because I like to get, for fellow authors, I think it's important to buy it in print as well. Page 15, which you know how Kindle book page numbers work. Here's what you say at the beginning of your book that I think sets the tone for your story, Surprised by Agape. The Greek word agape, which is my favorite word from any language, Justin says, means an unconditional and everlasting love. I've come to believe that the Creator has this kind of love for all of humanity. Whether you believe in a loving Creator, in many gods, or in nothing spiritual or divine, What unites us all is that we are human beings with fears, hopes, dreams, personalities, and the desire to be loved. Each one of us has a unique and strange life narrative that is important, and we express this experience of being human through artistic storytelling. That's pretty much what we're interested here at Mythic Mission. We understand mythos, the old Greek term, as a big story, a grand narrative, a narrated worldview of one's life, but also the big story that makes sense of the grand story we're all a part of. And I think you express that beautifully, but also tell us a little bit about this key word that is a part of your story. So I think this is a great way to start. What do you think?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, if you can't tell already, I enjoyed your book. I was able to get it read pretty quickly. So by no means is this, of importance. It's a short book, folks, that you can read very quickly, and you will, because it's well written. And I think you're going to find you probably have something in common with Justin as a fellow human being and imager of God. So I hope you'll give it a read. And we've got several questions tonight just to kind of set a conversational tone. We're going to be talking about Justin's journey, his book, his background, his understanding of the arts and coming to faith and myth, and several other things that'll come up. So Justin, why don't you just get us started? Because I know your book is pretty much an autobiography. Would you say that's an accurate summation?
Yes, indeed.
So I know we're going to be talking about your story and little bits across the hour, but just tell us, why Christianity? Because there are a lot of options out there with religion, and you know how many modern people view religion as just one other thing to choose. But as we know, it's a bit more important and more involved in that. This is a big life decision. So how did you become a Christian, and why?
Wow. So I grew up in Southern Free Will Baptist culture. And although I was thankful to be raised within that particular denomination, I had a really negative experience with it. Of course, not everyone does, but when I was exposed to this particular theological paradigm, that's all that I knew. And it was a lot of, teetotalism, rapture theology, the sort of Christianity was about getting the ticket to the celestial theme park so you won't have to spend eternity with Henry VIII. Uh, that sort of way. And the rapture
Nice.
theology, the rapture theology was quite traumatizing as well.
Mm,
And asking questions was really looked down upon. And
mhm,
there was some very sincere people within that culture that I grew up in Eastern North Carolina, and I really admired that they served people. They helped people out in the community with disabilities, or who were suffering and struggling without anything shown back in return, which, as you know, reflects agape love. So I really admire
mhm,
that. But I was an agnostic for
mhm,
a very long time. And also at the root of that agnosticism was father abandonment struggles.
mm,
My father unfortunately never fought his drug addiction, so that was deeply wounding. Although he was there some, I just
mm,
remember at one point he would disappear and then reappear, and it just caused this difficult confusion. And I was raised by some really good women, and they taught me really great virtues. How to have a balance between reason and emotions. Never assume things about people. Treat all people with respect. How to keep a clean house and be
mm,
responsible. Not take yourself too seriously. And how to be courageous, how to be strong, but also gentle. And I'm
mm,
really thankful that I had those women. They were like my clan mothers, and I'm very thankful. But I didn't believe in anything divine or supernatural. I
mhm,
didn't know if there was a god or many gods or some cosmic force that brought everything into being. Sort of, you could equate it to the Hindu Brahma. I
mhm,
had no idea, and I was really confused for a long time. And it was really hard to even articulate the questions and doubts that I had. And when I got older, I started asking more questions about the what's called the problem of evil and
mm,
suffering. How do you reconcile that with a good and loving creator? But also, what about beauty and goodness and truth and love? Where do those things come from? And morality, where does that come from? And human consciousness. And so I asked all these questions about science and evolution and faith.
mm,
And it was quite a journey. And so, although I found other worldviews really interesting,
Hmm.
I, when it came down to it, after asking many questions and having many doubts, and through discovering the music of John Foreman, the lead singer of Switchfoot,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
how he helped me with, even when I was an agnostic, I still admired his faith and that he was able to write music for people of all worldviews while still being authentic in who he was in his faith. And I
Well
really
said.
found, I really love that, man. And I grew up
Yeah.
on a lot of U2, Led Zeppelin,
Hmm.
Bob Marley, Simon and Garfunkel, the Beatles, Enya,
Nice.
Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, and I heard all of those sounds and hit in Switchfoot's music, as well as,
Hmm.
well, his is more folk, although I don't want to box it in, but his is
Right.
definitely has a more folk influence.
Agreed. Yeah.
But I really found that attractive, and
Hmm.
I remember him. I would read interviews that he, online, and watch interviews he did on YouTube, and I really was intrigued as to why he kept referencing C.S. Lewis. I didn't grow up reading Narnia.
Mm.
I remember a few references from Lewis here and there in middle school and high school, and Tolkien too. But
Hmm.
other than those references, I didn't read anything by them, and I had no idea who they were and why they
Mm.
are such amazing writers that continue to inspire so many people around the world. And so,
Hmm.
I okay, if John Foreman is referencing this C.S. Lewis writer so much, he must be worth checking out. And so I
Yeah.
thought, okay. And I remember I was watching a YouTube video that was an acoustic performance of the "This Is Home" song.
Oh, I love
That
that song.
I know it's beautiful, and
Hmm.
I was stoked that Switchfoot was given the opportunity to write it for the Prince Caspian movie. And I know
Hmm.
many people have various opinions about the Prince
Sure.
Caspian movie,
Yeah.
and I think the first one by far is the best, of course.
Ab-
That being,
Absolutely.
and the way John Foreman talked about this yearning and
Mm.
longing in the song was really intriguing to me, and I didn't really know what he meant. I thought, okay, what is he? I resonate with this this
Mm.
certain something more, not as escapism, as
Hmm.
you know, but being a finite human being in the here and now, yearning
Mm.
for meaning and purpose. And I was trying to articulate what did that mean, and I didn't really have the words. And so I was so moved by it. I got a one in volume set of the Chronicles of Narnia, which I still have to this day.
Mm.
And I had no idea what I was letting myself in for.
Hmm.
I correlate that to when Lewis was a young atheist and read George MacDonald's
Hmm.
Fantast. I've heard it pronounced differently,
Yeah. Me too.
both ways. And he read that, and as you know, he said it it baptized his imagination, and he came
Hmm.
back to reality and saw everything is enchanted. And what he encountered in that fascinating, wonderful book by the great Scotsman, it was holiness.
Hmm.
And that was a similar experience I had with, of course, all the Narnia books are amazing and epic and beautiful in their own right. But for me, as a personal preference, The Magician's Nephew is my favorite. Because the moment when Aslan sings Narnia into
Hmm.
being was my first experience of the transcendent, or the numinous, or Zinzu.
Hmm.
Um, and I remember the very day, the very moment, the very hour, and I was filled with this yearning and longing that was this combination of grief and joy, as Tolkien
Hmm.
has described.
Yep.
And
That's about right.
I didn't know how to rationalize it away. I knew that this couldn't be explained away in some scientific, it in a in an empirical box, this
Sure.
sort of, and I found it really interesting. And from that experience, and also when I had that experience, all of these things came together. I finally realized why myth and storytelling is important to our human tribe,
Yeah.
uh, why art is transcendent, and why Jesus of Nazareth told parables in the first century to the poor and the freaks and the broken and the outcast.
Mm.
And so, so many things came together. And and I was still even on the verge of, I didn't know if he actually existed, is he
Mm,
just legendary or, and, I asked questions about that, and N.T. Wright was
mm.
really helpful. And, of course,
Likewise.
Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Elder, Suetonius. I was really overwhelmed with as Jesus of Nazareth as a historical figure.
Mm,
Um, and I was fascinated by that. And I thought, wow, I had no idea that he actually did exist in the first century as a
right.
Jewish Aramaic speaking rabbi.
Mm,
And when it came down to it, though, I knew that intellectual questions are important. The existential questions, I suppose, are, and I know everyone has a different journey, but more
sure.
the intellectual questions had their place.
Of
But
course.
when it came down to it, the existential struggles about evil and suffering, but also what about goodness and beauty and truth? And
Mm,
I really honestly wanted to know if there was a good and loving creator that cared about all of humanity, that did something about death and sin and
mhm.
suffering. I just remember, I explored other worldviews: Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, paganism, Buddhism, Jainism, Baha'ism. They were all really fascinating.
Mhm.
When it came down to it, I came to know a person in Jesus of Nazareth as the same Jesus of faith and history, and that same agape love that changed the lives of the people in the first century and before, as you know, because the creator has revealed himself in many different cultures in different ways.
Mhm.
But I just remember coming to that place of realizing that I was a broken sinner, and I didn't find it dehumanizing or derogatory, with in contrast to the likes of Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, who
Mm,
see as you're degrading yourself,
sure.
um you're you're embracing a view that's dehumanizing.
Right.
Whereas the way I saw it was, okay, well, if this creator actually cared about humanity enough to do something about the sacred covenant that and however you view Genesis, that our primordial ancestors
Mhm.
broke a covenant in the beginning.
Mm,
Creator did something about that, and what I found really fascinating was he didn't come and overthrow the Romans, and as this military campaign, and
mhm.
it Yahweh to come back, cleanse the temple. This rabbi suffered a horrific death under the Romans and rose from the dead on that beautiful Easter day,
Yep.
making, as N.T. Wright puts it, new creation, making hope and healing and redemption possible right
Yeah.
here and now, and giving a glimpse of what is to come. And so I just
Love that.
remember I came to a place of surrender and
Mm,
repentance, and I embraced faith in Christ by grace, and He became my Lord and Savior,
mhm.
and completely changed my life. And that is the best thing that's ever happened to me.
Yeah. Justin, that's an extremely powerful story. I mean, I think your way of telling it, which is deeply genuine and honest, it exemplifies the importance of storytelling. That we situate ourselves in stories, we express ourselves in stories, we understand best through stories. We come to understand complex subjects through stories. And what I've found is my students, I interact with young people all the time. They don't think about these things in the abstract normally. And so when you ask them to examine their worldview, it's like, what, answer these questions, where do we come from? Who are we? But, if you tell it to them, or if you ask them, and I've just noticed this past week, we talked about this. I said, what story are we living in? And I'm standing on the shoulders of great scholars who have said this before me,
Mm.
but just asking the question that way is different, because that's how we process reality, excuse me,
Yeah.
is through story. And it's just you've just illustrated how powerful that is. And it's very important that I think everybody grasps that we all have a worldview, or as I like to say, we all have a myth. We're all living in a narrated view of the way the world is, and we've got to find our story and which story we belong to, and we've got to make sure it tells a good one. And
Hey,
you've told a good one, my friend. It's beautiful, and it's clear that it's honest. Um, and I know people get turned off, hearing the Lord and Savior talk. And I've always been struck by how N.T. Wright put this. He said, this is difficult for Americans, he says, in How God Became King, one of my favorite books he's written. Says,
great book.
we have yeah, it is. We have a constitutional monarchy here, but, we still understand about royalty over here in England.
Mm,
And it's different because, in the American Revolution, we fought to get rid of a king. And it's interesting how he frames it in that way. And he says, that kind of talk just, it seems foreign to us, but if you take that insight from Wright, and then you look at what Peter Kreeft has said in The Philosophy of Tolkien, one of my favorite books, I know you probably read it, where he says we all have and want kings in our hearts and our conscious, our subconscious. And he says something like, and I quote it in my book too, Arthur is sleeping in the subconscious tomb of our mind. And I said,
uh,
that's it right there, isn't it?
yes.
We might all go, ooh, sin, Lord and Savior. This guy's talking about he accepted Jesus. Ooh, he loves Jesus. Uh, but we all know there's that longing in there to want to follow a cause, to follow a leader. I know I've said in an interview recently, um, I was driving to Target one day and I thought, sometimes this just feels so banal and boring, and I want something like, I wish I were going out on a quest, that my family was depending on me. We all
Mm,
have this desire for enchantment, and this gets back to Sehnsucht, and that deep longing that we have. But I just think it's important to maybe disarm people who are listening, because we hear these kinds of stories so often that I think we're jaded and hardened against them, and that's just too bad.
mhm.
And maybe those are some barriers we can talk about there that I just mentioned to folks. So I don't know if that helps anybody who's listening, but thank you for telling your story. Um, a couple of things I was thinking of too. I didn't read Lewis until after Tolkien, and as I say in my book, I discovered Tolkien first as a teenager, late teenager.
Yeah,
Um,
I really
and
like your introduction. That was
thanks.
really, yeah.
Thanks, man. Lewis came later, and I use a lot of Lewis in the book because Lewis was so instrumental for me understanding some of the ideas that Tolkien, I wish, had expressed in greater detail.
Mm,
But the reason I brought this up, is that I didn't read, let's see, I'm trying to remember exactly when. I know I was finishing up grad school, I was just starting to teach as an adjunct, and I
mm,
just started to read the Narnia books, and then I devoured everything I could from Lewis. But I came to Lewis late in life. I didn't grow up reading it as a kid, and nor did I did with Tolkien. It happened 15, 16 years old. So I can relate there. So I hear you. And it's easy to see the man had just a wonderful way with expressing things and saying things that we've all felt and experienced. And it's almost like we've been waiting for someone like Lewis to come along and say it in just that way.
yes.
Um, and Justin, you'll know the passage I'm thinking of in The Weight of Glory, where he talks about how if we trust, and this anticipates our art subject, we'll get into talking about art and coming to faith, but says if we trust to the beauty in the things, then they'll become like dumb idols and break our hearts. But the longing wasn't in them, it came through them. To me, like, that's something I've felt, and I've never had those words to say it. And
Mm,
when I read that, I'm like, yeah, that's it. That's exactly what I've been trying to say for, decades. Um, and Lewis just had that way. So it's easy to see why he was so influential in your journey. Um, maybe talk a little bit more. I mean, I know you've said enough, probably enough, because I know there's other great topics we want to get into, but maybe let me phrase it this way. Is there anything else you want to say for our audience about how Lewis was instrumental in your becoming a Christian, or and then we'll get into your book and start talking some things that you talk about there. Is there anything we left out, you think?
So there are, as yourself and many other people can convey, so many reasons to admire Lewis. For me personally, his story is fascinating to
Mm,
me. I was intrigued as to why he was an atheist for many, many years.
right.
And his Irish Protestantism is really interesting. And I know the loss of his mother certainly probably had a good deal to do with his atheism, and then of course, as you know, his education under William Kirkpatrick, the Great
Mm.
Knot.
Yeah.
It
Oh yeah.
it brought together all of his his anger towards God,
Mm.
and I really found his journey of towards faith fascinating, because although the intellectual questions that he had were there, that
Mm.
Zinzuk, that yearning and longing, was so central to his life. And I had never read another writer like him who wrote about imagine this harmony between imagination and faith and
Mm.
reason and one's own personal experience coming together by grace. I
Mm.
found it really fascinating, and I loved how he rejected denominational warfare. Although he was Anglican, very Anglo-Catholic,
Yeah,
uh,
very much so.
and I loved how he focused on what he called mere Christianity.
Hmm.
And after my conversion, I came to understand, whereas before I didn't know anything about the Greek Orthodox Church or Russian Orthodox or Anglicanism or Catholicism, or you know or the creeds, the liturgy, the Eucharist. It was all foreign to me growing up in a non-creedal teetotalism,
Mm.
culture with a lot of fundamentalism, which, as you know, is really difficult, and many people have a very negative experience with that brainwashing,
Certainly.
proselytizing, and etc.
Yeah.
And Lewis's writings helped save my sanity when I could hardly function, and I had all this. And again, it wasn't anything to do with my family. It was just that culture that I
Mm.
was in, and being exposed to those ideas. Because in a particular geographical location, culture is mixed with politics and a certain theology,
Yep.
um, and it's like that for many people, just depending on which part of the world it is. And
Absolutely.
so Lewis's journey towards embracing faith in Christ is fascinating, and I love Surprised by Joy. In fact, Surprised by Joy is my favorite of all of his nonfiction.
Mm.
Of course, Christianity, that is such a timeless work, and
Of
it's
course.
amazing. But I love Surprised by Joy, even though it was called, I forget which of the Inklings called it Suppressed by Jack.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I
That's
think
right.
maybe it was Owen Barfield or Hugo
Maybe.
Dyson. I can't remember. Uh,
That's
but
great. Yeah.
I, I loved how in that he wrote such a personal
Hmm.
story. He called that by one of his friends. It's very
Yeah.
funny,
Yeah.
but his hellish experiences in World War I, and his atheism pardons, and then he ends up meeting Hugo Dyson and
Hmm.
Tolkien, and encounters George MacDonald and G.K.
Hmm.
Chesterton, and even the um, poet like William Butler Yeats that roused the Zinzuk in his life. And
Hmm.
so he had this amazing appreciation for literature, and was so gifted and with language and with writing, and was steeped in all the Greek and Roman
Mm.
and North Celtic myths. And it's amazing to me how voracious of a reader he was.
Oh yeah.
And that story, of him coming to know Christ when he was on a ride to Whipsnade Zoo with his
Hmm.
brother.
Horny.
Indeed, and is really fascinating how he said when he set out he didn't believe Christ was the Son of God, and then when he reached the zoo he did. And as you know,
Hmm.
how legendary conversation he had with Tolkien on Addison's Walk about Christianity being the true myth at all. And all
Mm.
this important to me, because whereas before, myths and legends and uh, fantasy and things associated with magic and um, ancient uh, pagan stories and beliefs was always frowned upon,
Mm.
or or viewed as diabolical, whereas Lewis and Tolkien had a high regard for the ancient pagan past. And
Especially the northern stuff,
yeah,
the
yeah,
Scandinavian,
and I
Anglo-Saxon.
really absolutely, and I
Mm.
admire that about them, because they
Me too.
allowed me to realize that those people were people just like us, Celtic people, the Nordic people, different cultures that had all these interesting death and resurrection festivals and patterns that was important to their spirituality, religion, and all those like Balder from the Norse and
Mm-hmm.
Bacchus, Greek, Osiris from the Egyptian, and
Mm-hmm.
all other dying and rising God stories. Um, and the way that Tolkien and Lewis called Christianity the true myth was so fascinating to me because it brought together the ancient pagan past together with the Christian story happening in the first century, which
Mm-hmm.
is there's this being the one that happened in space, time, and history, and through
That's right.
Jesus's incarnation, death, and resurrection, there's remission for sins. All these death and resurrection patterns are fulfilled, and there's hope and healing in the here and now, and again, and come in the New Jerusalem. And I found
Mm-hmm.
it actually fascinating, and also because Lewis was so widely read, one of the most wonderful things about him is that he leads you to Jane Austen, to Chaucer, to Shakespeare, George MacDonald,
Mm-hmm.
William Yeats, John Keats, Byron, all the ancient myths, Dorothy Sayers, Charles Williams, the
Yes,
Bronte.
Eliot. Yep.
Yes, yes.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't get enough of it. And I really was, uh, I was, it's hard to find the words. I found this whole new world opened up to me. And I found that I could sit down with a book and pay attention to the ideas,
Mm-hmm.
uh, voice of uh, words that the writer was using, the things the writer was conveying.
Mm-hmm.
And it was it became a burning passion. And through Lewis also I found my voice as a writer, whereas
Mm-hmm.
before I had a lot of doubts and I didn't really know what I was going to do with my life. I wasn't going to be a doctor or a lawyer or a mechanic or a carpenter. Wasn't really good at much. I did some carpentry with my grandfather in the past and know a little bit about cars, not
Mm-hmm.
much, but through Lewis, I found a passion that became a vocation. And the more I wrote and read, and then I would meet kindred spirits through his influence, I've met yourself and David Bates and
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Don King at Montreat College. So many amazing and beautiful and rich experiences in my life happened because of the great Irishman's influence. And I'm so thankful that Christ gave the world such a unique writer like himself.
Me too. Well said. Well, you brought up myth, and I want to combine a couple of my questions, and then I think we'll finish with talking a little bit more about your book and future projects.
Yeah.
But I think the next two topics will go together hand in glove. Um, the idea of mythos or myth, and you've talked about the legendary conversation that Dyson, Tolkien, and Lewis had in 1931, which was in September of 1931. Lewis wrote some letters to Arthur Greaves, his good lifelong friend there afterwards, before and afterwards, and continued to correspond with him. Some of the most interesting information in the collected letters of C.S. Lewis are his letters to Arthur Greaves about especially that conversation. So that conversation pertains or includes the topic, but not just the topic, but especially the topic of myth. So let's, for our audience, I know a lot of people who follow Mythic Mission know what a myth is, but let's talk about what myth is and how it's connected to this idea of Sehnsucht, of longing, that German word that means a stabbing, a pining, a joy. What did he say? A desire that itself is more desirable than any other desire, something along those lines. So myths evoke that. So what is a myth? I mean, for most people, myths are false stories. They're wastes of time. They're husks of flimsy narratives that we can peel back to get a moral truth and lesson, and then throw away the husk. So how can we re-mythologize people this evening? What can we say to maybe make people take myth more seriously, do you think?
So in my experience, it's been really interesting to talk with people who have a very different worldview than myself, and we can find common ground. And the common ground is through some form of literature, whether it's music or painting or film.
Mhm.
And it's exciting to me when that happens, because those art forms bring down barriers of politics, social status, and religion.
Yep.
And I'll give an example. There are a few friends that have a different worldview than myself, and we love Neil Gaiman's writings and
Mm.
Norse mythology, American gods, the ocean at
Yeah.
the end of the lane.
Mhm.
He's a very good modern day fantasy writer, and when you read his work, you could certainly see the influence of MacDonald and Lewis and Tolkien and Lord Dunsany and William Butler Yeats,
Mhm.
William Morris. And those experiences, when I look back on them, remind me of the power of myth and how amazingly arrogant it is to view myth or spirituality or faith as primitive superstition. That's a very enlightenment 18th century enlightenment way of thinking,
Yes.
which is, and many other parts of the world aren't like that, as you know. And as you see in our culture, all the a good example is all the Marvel movies and the
Mhm.
DC movies. People can't get enough of it. And
No.
I like myself, I'm not I don't know a lot about Marvel and DC. I read some of the comics growing up, and I've seen some of the films, and they're fun and exciting and epic. But those are myths.
Yeah.
They're modern American myths, borrowed
Mhm.
from ancient myths, just recreated in our culture. And people
Mm.
can't get enough of it. And I love
Mm-mm.
talking with I love talking with people about it, what gets them excited about it, and why did they like that particular film.
Mhm.
And, and it just reminds me that from our primitive ancestors around, in the mead hall or bonfires or campfires, that it all started with oral storytelling tradition
Mm.
to the hardback and paperback books, music and literature, art that will never die away, because myth is a attempt to explore what it means to be human. It's
Mhm.
for the divine in the here and now. It's an attempt to understand the world around us, to explore questions and to find answers. And
Well said.
even when I was an agnostic, I never bought into scientism,
Mm.
and I found it really dull. And also, just like, for example, as creative as a physicist and scientist as Stephen Hawking was, and he did a lot of great work and
Mhm.
was well respected. I've read a few of his books, and he was incredible. And the film made about his life, The Theory of
Mhm.
Everything, really beautiful. But the kind of worldview that he conveyed in his life and his writings is the same with Steven Pinker, or as another guy who debated John Lennox, that I think Peter Atkins is his name.
Mhm.
The kind of arrogant empirical worldview that they embrace and convey. And I was
Sure.
always bothered when people like that, and again, I'm sure they're really nice people, hopefully,
Hope so.
indeed.
Mm.
But when you write off people who are religious or spiritual, that are more intellectual than you, or more, or smarter, just as smart as you,
Mm.
just really silly and really childish. And
Oh yeah.
wow, when I was an agnostic, I would, if I was an atheist, I would be embarrassed by Richard Dawkins.
Yeah. Yeah.
I couldn't. If you title your book "The God Delusion," that it's already by begging the question.
Mhm.
And as funny and as witty as Christopher Hitchens was, and it was really sad what happened to him. And I
Of
know he was
course.
friends with Francis Collins,
Mhm.
and Larry Taunton from the Veritas Forum, and they
Mhm.
liked him. They said he was a really likable guy, as well as John Lennox. They
Certainly.
sort of begging the question, when you already assume that spiritual experience is a delusion, or that faith is a delusion, just because you can't fit it in to an,
Empirical paradigm.
because, and you know in my experience, when it came down to, like, for example, phenomenon of human consciousness, the
Mhm.
phenomenon of the fact that we are here, of love, of art, beauty, religious, spiritual experience. To
Mm.
me, it's much more logical and beautiful to believe that it had a divine source
Mhm.
rather than just the laws of physics brought it together. We don't know how exactly. I always found that really silly. And as you
A
know,
stretch.
yes, it was sort of baffling. I never bought into that.
Yeah.
And uh and if I was still an agnostic, I would be open to spiritual experience
Sure.
and wouldn't write off um that being a reality. And I would probably love Lewis and MacDonald and Tolkien and Madeline L'Engle.
Mhm.
Probably not as much as I do now because, sharing the same worldview with those writers makes their work more rich and
Enjoyable. Mhm.
nourishing. So yes, those are certain memories from personal experience as to understanding why myth is powerful and transcendent, and it never goes away, and it's not primitive superstition. In fact, we owe a lot to our primitive ancestors, agriculture, art,
Sure.
religion, medicine, all those incredible things. And it was really helpful to me and as you know, like growing up in the kind of culture I did, there was always this exhausting debate about science and faith.
Mm.
And then when I came to really understand it, it's not really science versus or creation versus evolution, it's scientism in
Mhm.
that is a religion in itself, and the people that propagate it have their own agenda.
Oh yeah.
Where, you know, from my understanding, like for example, the big was not the Big Bang proposed by a Jesuit priest, you know,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and at least Sir Isaac Newton was, although he was into some interesting things like alchemy,
Yeah.
esoteric esoteric stuff,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
Charles Williams, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
was still a deeply uh, believing theist.
Mhm.
So it's really important to understand. And when I tell people, science does not answer the most important philosophical questions that we have.
No.
All it all it does is just finite human theory and finite human understanding that get. I know
Mhm.
there is the thing as facts in the objective world. I don't have any qualms with that. But
Mm.
when it becomes a religion in itself and tries to become a deity itself, it becomes chronological snobbery, and that's exactly
Absolutely.
what it is. And yeah,
Mhm.
as you know, like I've read quotes from N.T. Wright about atheists who are embarrassed by Dawkins and
Yeah.
Harris and etc. So
Well, I mean, because listen, we know the scientific story is a myth itself. If myth is defined as in the ancient Greek sense, a grand narrative with truth value about the world we live in, the story that science can answer all our questions, that we don't need philosophy or theology because our brain can't tell us accurate information about it, can't be trusted, but we can trust what our brain tells us about science, curiously enough. Then what we're not realizing is a spell is being woven here. For those of you who don't know, the Old English word for story was spell. So that is a myth itself. That there's the myth of the scientific revolution of the Enlightenment. So what folks don't realize is that we all live within a paradigm expressed as a story, which we call often a worldview. The paradigm is a worldview,
yes,
and not only is that the case, but it's also the case that science can't fit everything in it. How does science explain itself? How does
mm,
science explain a comprehensible universe? The quest for meaning is not the job of science, it's the job of
no,
philosophy.
right,
So how can it explain itself? How can it justify itself? The Lewis, I think, said, I think it was in Mere Christianity or elsewhere, the thing we measure with has to be independent of the thing measured. So
right,
it's not very good to say, well, scientism is true. Scientism is the view that science can explain everything, and you know, um, it just doesn't make much sense. So there's that, and this idea that myths need to be historical. I think people take history for granted. That it's not an empirical science. It can be. I mean, there's archaeological evidence, there's numismatic evidence, coins. There's evidence, and it's empirical, sure, and it can be radiocarbon dated, but that's not always the case. So
Yeah.
we need to understand too that while
Mm.
myths are sometimes ostensibly historical, they're not always historical, but they can have truth value to them still.
And
And so, right? I
as
mean, there it
as you
is.
were as you were saying, how it's important to understand how myth was viewed to an ancient mind, as
Exactly.
you were saying.
Well, and there's this too. At least we know the ancient Greeks had two words, mythos and logos. I mean, they were not pre-scientific dum-dums who used
Mm.
myth as a way of, well, we don't know what rain and lightning and thunder is, so we're going to call that Zeus.
Mm.
They had ways of investigating the natural world. We have the pre-Socratics like Thales and Anaximander and Anaxagoras who do that. And now, of course, they didn't have modern science, but they were still interested in finding physical explanations, naturalistic explanations. But they had more than one way of looking at the world. So they had a more capacious understanding of reality, whereas we think that they had only a very myopic, well, we can't explain it, so let's call it a myth. That's a caricature of myth in ancient peoples. That's not how they thought. And the linguistic evidence alone kind of proves that. So, mythos and logos were two complementary ways of looking at the world, at least from a Greek standpoint. But if you look for those ideas in Chinese culture, Japanese culture, you'll find them. Maybe not in the same language, of course, but you'll find the ideas, the abstract ideas there. All cultures understood that there were multiple ways of stating truth about the world we live in. So it's just this tired old faith versus religion. I'm sorry, faith versus science, false dichotomy that people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, the four horsemen of the atheists, as they were called years ago. And
Yeah.
there are more respectable atheists like John Gray.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think of Julian Baggini. There are several others that are, I think, just much better thinkers and more coherent and logically consistent. So we're not just shooting fish in a barrel here, looking at the easy ones, but it's easy to see why some are embarrassed by those thoughts because they're just very uninformed. So
Right.
anyway,
Yeah.
I think that's good for myth. I want to close out, as much as I hate to say we have to start closing out, but we've heard the most, I think, important bits about your story, about myth. Let's talk about what agape love is, and then tell us what you're up to these days. I know you have another book coming out with Grant Hudson, so if you can speak to those things, and then we'll tie it up.
Absolutely. So when I came to understand a- agape with my mind and my heart was when I came to know Christ, and then uh, it became a reality rather than just an idea. And when I
Mm,
through a dark night of the soul years ago, 6 or 7 years ago now, that was related to father abandonment struggles, and it was really traumatizing. And I mean, you never think you could get so low. And I just remember coming to a point where I didn't reject the goodness and agape love of Christ, but I
mhm,
really struggled. And there were two suicide attempts and two hospitalizations.
mm,
And a lot of people didn't know how to respond. And some people were more understanding than others. I've been through the furnace of that.
mhm,
And of course, I never want to go through anything like that again. But coming out of that suffering, I came to experience the agape love of Christ in perhaps a way, in perhaps in a way that could could have could have been quite different.
mm,
So what I'm trying, sorry, sometimes it's hard to find the right
mm.
words
No,
when
I understand.
when you're a writer, but the of course one and can never plumb the depths of agape love in this life,
Mhm,
but going through that trauma and suffering and struggling, the Saint John of the Cross, dark night of the soul,
yes.
the agape love of Christ became more real in my life. And
Mm,
even when I was going through that, his agape love sustained me, which
mm,
I say it saved my life and restored my sanity. And I felt like there was there was certainly a renewed passion for life and literature and art, and a resurrection of faith. And then throughout of that suffering, I was able to go to Montreat College and finish my degree, and Oxford, England, and then I was able to write Surprised by Agape, and it was just uh, like that Lewis line from A Grief Observed. All reality is like classic. It just the amazing agape love of Christ just shattered all the ideas that I had of what my life was going to be like, because I thought my life was over.
Yeah.
There wasn't any purpose, and it was a curse to be a conscious human being on the planet, and perhaps I was deluded. And of course, I came to understand how wrong I was. And looking back on that, I am so thankful. And I would say agape is certainly the theme of my life. And I got the idea for the book, 7 or 8 years ago, and kept writing it and editing and revising, and eventually through a C.S. Lewis Facebook page, connected with Grant Hudson of Clarendon House Publishing, and he saw that I had published just a small draft for a creative project for a C.S. Lewis class I was taking under Dr. Don King, and he sent me an email, and we exchanged a few, and he told me that I would like to offer you a contract, and that meant the world to me. And how do I go from lying on a suicide hospital bed to being able to finish my degree, to having a renewed faith, an amazing church community, artistic community, a move to the mountains of North Carolina, Oxford, a book signing, podcast interviews, Goodreads reviews, Amazon reviews. There's no way that any of that is by chance. It's all by grace, and I'm so thankful for it. And
I am too.
Thank you. And as each day goes by, I continue to marvel at the agape love of Christ. So thankful. And in regard to the Surprised by Myth book, that will probably be coming out in a month or so.
Really, that soon?
Indeed. So Grant Hudson,
all right.
Grant Hudson got the idea for it last year, and then I would write short drafts out here and there, and about 4 or 5 months ago, I mentioned it to him, and he said it would be a good idea to explore it and see where it would go. And once I had a draft, I sent it to him, and he was happy with it, and said I'll edit and revise it, and he sent me a link to a few articles that he's written that he's going to include in it. And
that's what I was going to ask you. Yeah.
Thank you. So it's being able to co-write this book with this Englishman who's been reading and writing about Lewis Tolkien and the Inklings and MacDonald and Chesterton since 1974, longer than I've been alive.
Yeah, wow. You and me both.
It's amazing, and I'm so thankful for that opportunity. And so the book is going about the cultural importance of myth and how it transcend it, how it is a search for the divine, the healing power of music and literature and art, which is a form of myth, of of storytelling. Why Lewis, Tolkien, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, Dorothy Sayers, Donald, G.K. Chesterton, and Joy Davidman are so inspiring, and how many different artists they've inspired, and personal experiences of reading their works and going to conferences, and meeting all different kinds of people who have been inspired by them. So the book has been a lot of fun.
It sounds like fun.
Thank you, man. I'm so thankful. He's the one making it happen, so I owe a great debt to him. He's been a professional editor for a long time. I'm not an academic or a scholar, simply a writer. Maybe one day, but it's been really meaningful and challenging. It was quite a lot, quite tiring, but
I know that.
Oh yes, especially as when it comes to the editing and revising.
It's a lot of work, man.
Yes.
It's my heart goes out to the people who are gifted in doing this, and I've tried it. And I'm thinking, no, not for me.
It's amazing
Uh,
how we have a gift with it, and just
mm,
they know how to structure a narrative,
oh yeah.
and the word choice and the grammar and the flow. It's all it's amazing. And so
Hmm.
I'm working very hard on that. Also have
Good.
an ancillary novel coming out
That's
called
right.
Marty and Irene through Breaking Rules Publishing,
Hmm.
um, about an Irish musician named Irene and an American writer named Marty, and they go through a lot of trauma and struggle. Um, explore a lot of philosophical questions, but they also help each other find healing and
Mm,
hope. And they collaborate artistically. There's a love story there that's true to life.
good.
Um,
Good.
Definitely inspired by Baron and Luthien and
Oh,
Aragorn and Arwen. So
oh, that's
there's
awesome.
there's some of that there. I wanted to capture, even though it's set in the modern world and it's
Sure.
not, a work of fantasy. I did want to bring in some Celtic spirituality and
Mm,
make narrative have an epic feel. And I'm really excited about that. Worked really hard on it, and
mm.
uh, Irish poet friend named Jerry White, she endorsed it, and another an American writer friend named Henry Mitchell, he endorsed it, and
Wow.
I couldn't have done it without their help, because they've been editing for many years,
Mm,
and they told me they wouldn't endorse it until they were satisfied with the final draft, which it
that's very good.
was challenging and a lot of work. So it's
Mm,
been quite tiring to work on those two works and finish those, but I finished, and finished a short story called The Writer that's going to be published in a short paperback through um, it's called the Writer's Journey blog anthology,
oh,
uh,
cool.
and that will be coming out in December. And Elaine is the lady's name who is doing the editing for that.
Wow.
Um, and another short poem that's called Mystical Mountain. That's
Ooh,
Thank you, man. And it's
yeah.
coming in a paperback anthology in October. And if I remember correctly, the title is Cities Travels Around the World, Landscapes and Cityscapes, I think is the title.
Hmm. Well, that
So
sounds very, very good.
thank you, man.
Yeah.
So working on these different creative projects has kept me out of my head. It's kept me,
Yeah.
which can sometimes not be a good place to be, and it's kept me
Yeah.
in good spirits and kept me cultivating my craft, and it's kept me thriving in community. And I'm really thankful to Christ for all these opportunities. It brings me a lot of joy.
Yeah. Well, I have to say I can relate to that. It's not always a good place for us to be alone with our thoughts, which is
No,
why folks' community is so important. I mean, I know I've known minor bouts of depression in my life, nothing like some of my family members and what it sounds like you've struggled with, which is nothing trivial at all. And I know that the bouts that I've struggled with are bad for me, and it's most powerful to have community, to have like-minded people, and to have projects to throw yourself into and to collaborate. It's such an important part of being human. So now with COVID cases on the rise and just the world just being always being an uncertain place, it's so important for us to foster community, which I know you have a passion for, and I do too. So I'm happy to know you.
thank
And
you.
even
Well,
though our friendship is distant now, I hope one day to shake hands with you.
yeah,
And yeah, and I know Surprised by Agape was a comfort to me and confirming many of my struggles. And I thank you for that. I think based on the reviews I read too, it was echoed by many other people. So
good.
thank you for being vulnerable. That's the most important part. It shows that we don't take ourselves too seriously. It shows that, you don't have an ego. You don't care if people know that you've struggled. I don't really trust anybody that hasn't struggled. Life is hard. So
Yeah,
I think your story is just very important. So thank you
thank,
for writing it. And
thank you.
I wish we had more time to talk, but I know we've got to say goodbye for now.
Yeah,
Um, I hope people will buy your book and read it. I'm gonna definitely talk it up, and I
thank you.
really appreciate you becoming a friend and for coming on Mythic Mission, Justin. Thank you.
It's an honor. Thank you for having me, and it's an honor to call you friend. Cheers.
Likewise. Cheers. I'm out. I'm going to refill after the interview here. Well,
Enjoy.
good night, everybody.
Good night.